As a volunteer board member, regardless of the type of nonprofit, it's necessary to take steps to reduce any potential loss or damage that could incur. So whether you're just joining a board or you are a longtime board member, we hope that you'll learn something new today. So welcome. I have Carrie McDonald here with me today from RV Nucio and Associates, and we are going to talk about some of the interesting shifts that are happening in the education world around the shifting of responsibility from schools and school districts to parent groups, and how what that looks like and how that impacts parent groups these days. What I mean by that is that given the fact that a lot of school budgets are getting smaller and smaller, it feels, or at least need to be stretched further these days than they used to, schools that have parent groups, those parent groups are picking up a lot of the costs of various activities and items. And sometimes without realizing the burden that they carry by doing these things. So, Carrie, maybe you can help me today. Welcome, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're really happy you're here to clarify some of these things. So maybe you can help me with a few scenarios that come to mind. The first one that kind of concerns me is groups that start paying salaries for some of the folks that come in and help out at the school. So for example, I see art docents a lot. Can you talk about that? What happens when these parent groups start paying for things like salaries that they never used to?
Well, we've seen over the years schools push the responsibilities of particularly after school programs and daycare programs onto these groups. And these programs typically require to have teachers or people hired to run these activities. From an insurance standpoint, that can be insured. From a salary standpoint, you now start getting into tax issues, employment liability issues, all of the laws and legal issues that would arise as being an employer, basically. And so these groups will often come and say, well, we're going to have the parents pay the money directly to these people. That does not stop the employer-employee relationship. Or they will say, we're going to 1099 these teachers, and that does not stop the employer-employee relationship. And they're truly not 1099 employees. We are seeing laws changed throughout the United States very strictly on what they call gig employees. And these parent groups are being forced to take on what traditionally the schools used to do. And so we always advise a group to go back to the school, try to push them to pay or fund the enrichment programs or these extracurricular activities, and not for them to pay the salaries themselves, because it's really outside of the scope that they want to be involved in, and they legally will become liable and personally liable. I've seen it happen with multiple nonprofits where they've paid 1099s, and then the Employment Development Department comes and files charges against them, and they have to come up with all of the other taxes that have to be paid along with a salary. So it is really a cumbersome thing for groups to get involved in, and they try to figure a way to get out of it. But all they would have to have is one teacher go and turn them in, and they will be personally held liable, because that's not going to be covered under an insurance policy.
Gosh, that's concerning.
And there's also one more thing. If they are paying salaries, then they have that employer relationship with that employee. And if that person is injured on the job, it won't be covered under one of the policies unless they have workers' compensation insurance.
Oh, and right.
They will have coverage under, say, a general liability policy if that teacher is accused of sexual abuse or doing something of that nature. So that moves over to another policy. But there's multiple issues when they start paying salaries and running these programs. So we try to teach them how to run these programs on a volunteer basis, if they can get people to volunteer teaching versus paying them, and make it academic in nature. That is the ideal way to run some of these programs. And then daycare, that is typically run by the states. Every state has laws of how a daycare should be run. So,
Right.
so that is really, again, those laws are outside of the scope of the insurance. That's when a group has to look into those laws and have whatever state's requirements are to run an actual daycare.
So parent groups really need to be very careful about this whole salary thing and find other ways to get around this.
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. I'm curious, another thing that I often hear about with groups are groups that fundraise for like big ticket items like playgrounds. Who carries the burden of liability for something like that? Is there a way for a parent group to fundraise for that, but not own the equipment?
Well, it's a very common item that groups fundraise for. And oftentimes they purchase it and they install it as well. So there's a lot of problems with the purchase and installment of these. The best way to do, let me back up for a second, is once that equipment has been installed, that playground equipment, some of it can sit around for 20 years. So if the invoice has been paid by the parent-teacher group and the installation's been done by the parent-teacher group, that group maintains the liability for the life of that playground equipment.
Oh,
So
wow.
if it's sitting there for 20 years, they will be legally liable. During school hours, off school hours, during summer sessions, whenever school's out, that playground equipment, kids can get on that, and there's a lot of bad injuries that can happen off of playground equipment.
Right,
Some
right.
schools have completely, removed playground equipment from their properties because of this. So we advise them always to give the money to the school and let the school purchase the equipment and let the school oversee the installation of the equipment. So that releases them out of the liability and puts the liability on the school. But then you still get what you want, the playground equipment for the school.
That seems like a really good idea. That's great. Okay. What kind of, this is probably a really big question, really probably too broad for the scope of a podcast, but what the heck? What what kinds of things are appropriate in your opinion for a parent group to fundraise for, and what aren't?
Multiple activities can be done very, very safely. And I feel that these groups can do very well by having multiple different types of activities, whether it be something as simple as a bake sale or selling candy, or carnival, car washes. Any of those types of things are very common. What we are seeing now is more fundraising being done online, and that in itself can cause legal issues. And one of our biggest lawsuits recently came from a group that hired a fundraising company. The fundraising company did all of the work for them, and they would get an override from the fundraising company. And the fundraising company gave out toys to the kids that sold the most of whatever they were fundraising for. And so the little toy was being played with by this child, and it was like one of those spinning top things, very small piece of toy, and it spun up and hit his uncle in the eyeball, and then the eye was severely damaged. And because that piece of equipment was made in China, we could not bring in the manufacturer of the equipment for the malfunctioning of it. So the parent-teacher group had to pay the entire loss, and it was a catastrophic loss.
Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so your online fundraising has its issues as well. The other thing that I've seen in the online fundraising is a lot of these fundraising companies take the money and run. So you have to be very careful. There was a just about right before COVID hit, there was company that got literally hundreds of thousands of dollars from groups over across the USA that literally just stole these groups' money and took it. So they want to partner with a good fundraising company when they do that. We see them doing all sorts of activities and fundraising activities that go quite well, as long as they have proper protocols in place, and some of them are very well done, and these groups can make a lot of money. Silent auctions, that's a common one. And then if they are going to sell alcohol at those, then they have a liquor liability exposure. So that's a really common fundraiser that brings in a lot of money. So we have to advise them, okay, well, then you need to have liquor liability coverage to cover that, and we can take care of that for them.
Is the same thing hold true for like raffles for events that are considered like games of chance or gambling?
Yeah. So under a general liability policy, you have what's called products liability coverage. So when they are raffling off items, those items can cause an injury, right, to somebody. And so the groups do have that coverage under a general liability policy. We advise them not to ever sell things that can go down through a child's choke tube, that type of small of an item. We've had raffles be very successful.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Wow. Lots to think about when it comes to, who's responsible for what when you have an activity and hold an event. So great. Thank you for sharing all those scenarios, Carrie. I really appreciate it. Appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.